Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to History Heights. I'm Gail Macinda. When lists are made of the most important inventions, the Ford Model T is almost always on that list, and well, it should be. It's hard to overstate the importance that the Model T had on American culture. It changed the way things were manufactured, it changed the way people spent their leisure time. It changed the American infrastructure with the need for more and better roads. And it inspired new industries like motels, roadside restaurants, and attractions. It changed where people lived because now they could live further away from their place of employment, so suburbs became possible. The 1950s culture I was born into simply did not exist before the Model T. But yet I've never driven one, or even ridden in one, and maybe you haven't either. And perhaps, like me, you're curious to learn a little bit more about this marvelous machine. A great way for us to learn more about the Model T is to visit with my friend Rankin Barnes, author and founder of Crankin' Engines, and you'll find his contact information down in the description box below. Rankin is an award-winning instructor with over 30 years experience teaching automotive technology at state and community colleges. He has owned and managed automotive repair businesses and has established apprentice programs. Rankin, it is so good to have you back here again on History Heights. Welcome.
Thank you, Gail. It's always a pleasure talking with you, especially about cars.
We do like that topic, don't we? I
Yes.
know that you've got a Ford Model T in 1917, I believe. I would love to hear the story about how you acquired that car.
It's kind of a long story. I'll pare it down a bit. When I was a little kid, I played with my friend Brian, and his dad had antique cars in the family garage, and they were restored. And that was probably around 1954, 1955, something like that. And his dad let us stand in the seats of the restored cars and play like we were taking trips and just pretend that we were driving the cars. And that sparked a strong interest in me. Maybe it was there before. I'm not really certain, but it certainly added to it if it was there before, of a love affair with automobiles. And later on, when I was 16, I asked my friend's father, Mr. Kelly, if there would be a way where I could buy a Model T, because I really liked the cars, and they were unusual even when in the late 60s when I was 16. I'm showing my age, or I'm telling my age. And Mr. Kelly had one in the dairy barn. They were no longer milking, but there was a car in the dairy barn, and it truly was a barn find. After about 2 or 3 hours of work, I got the car started. I should say we got the car started, and I drove it home. And I've had it ever since. And drove it in a few parades, and it's been sitting for many, many years now. And I just started it with your encouragement back in the spring.
That's very cool. Well, now that we have talked a little bit about that car, I know that the Model T was in production for nearly 20 years.
That's correct.
Was there a lot of change or any change in the model itself during that time?
The changes were minimal. They changed from the design of the car minimally. The engine, the transmission, the drivetrain didn't change much at all. The earlier cars, the cars that were built from 1908 until about 1919, 1920, didn't have a starter, didn't have a generator, didn't have a fuel pump, oil pump, water pump. You know, any of the things that we think of today on an automobile Those weren't used on the Model T. It was a very, very simple automobile. And the earlier cars up until 1916 had a lot of brass on them. They had brass radiator shells and brass lights, and they even had a brass canister on the running board in the very early cars that made acetylene gas for, they were called carbide lights. So they even had gas lights back in 1908, 9, 10, along in there. But basically, they were pretty much the same until they added starters and generators. They didn't even have alternators.
Well, speaking of starters, you were very gracious to allow us to use some clips from a video that you made about getting that car started, and what a job that turned out to be. So let's take a moment and look at some of those clips now.
Hello, my name's Rankin Barnes, and I want to talk to you about my Model T Ford. This is a 1917 car, and it's going to be started similar to the way an Indianapolis racer would have been started on the first Indianapolis 500. It has a hand crank right down there at the bottom, and I'm going to go through the process of starting this engine. It has no electrical starter. It doesn't even have a key. So this is an old car. It's a 1917. Got some age on it, doesn't it? Okay, here we go. One of the first things that I'll do is I'll retard the spark. What's that mean? Well, it means that there are two levers here on the steering column. One is for the spark, and that changes the ignition timing. That has to be pushed all the way up, and I have to increase the gasoline feed. This would be like the gas pedal on today's car, and pull up the handbrake. Let me show you the handbrake. This lever right down here to my left, just looking down through the steering wheel, is the handbrake lever, and this needs to be pulled up to make sure that the engine doesn't take off and run over you. Did you see it slip forward there? I rigged up a wire to make sure that that handbrake doesn't fly off, because when this engine starts up, it's in gear if that handbrake flies off. And then we have to switch on the battery, and that's the ignition box. Right there is the ignition box, and each one of these are coils for the 4 cylinders. So let's switch that ignition box on right now. We're going to start this car on the battery, and then we'll switch it over to a magneto, and we will have to increase the timing by pulling this lever down. I'm going to change the air fuel mixture and pull it through a few turns. This will suck some gas into the engine. You have to push in on the crank to engage the crankshaft. Push the choke in. Choke it. Turn it on. Crank it through. Make sure the coils are buzzing. And then see if it'll start. Yesterday I had to take the spark plugs out and prime it by pouring a little bit of gas down into the spark plug holes, and then put the spark plugs back in. I may have to do that again today. Okay, that's priming. Now I'm going to put the spark plugs back in, one at a time. let's try it again. This is work. I've had to change clothes. It's hot. The sun's right on me. I've choked it. We got spark. That's all she wrote for right now, folks.
You know, that seemed to be a real challenge to get that car started. How much of that do you think was because it had been, of the car's age, it had been sitting a while? And how difficult was it to start those cars at that time when they were new?
If it was cold weather, if it was below 40 degrees, it was difficult to start them. The oil was thick, and people would put pans of hot water under the cars to try to get them to warm up in the wintertime. They would jack up a rear wheel and crank it with the rear wheel off the ground, because the rear wheel would act like an inertia wheel. Once you got it started spinning, it was easier to get the car started. But my car was hard to start because it hadn't been started in 10 years, and I had to work on the carburetor and in addition prime the fuel system and prime the spark plug. Had to remove the spark plugs and prime the engine itself, and clean a lot of electrical contacts. So the process was longer on my car because it had been sitting for over 10 years. And I haven't used it much in the last 30 or 40 years. So it's spent a lot of time just sitting up on blocks.
I think that gives a great testament to the car itself, that even after sitting for this long, it was still able to start at all. There's not a lot of things, not a lot of products that are 100 years old that could have been sitting for that amount of time and still be able to work. So I think that's really quite remarkable in and of itself.
That's right. And I did buy 2 brand new tires for it. And I'm going to get those put on this summer. And I plan to drive that down my dirt road driveway. I live a half mile off main road. So I will take that for a little bit of a cruise a little bit later on this summer. Maybe take the grandchildren for a ride.
That would be a real treat. I hope that you'll keep us apprised of your progress on that as you go along, because I know that we would like to at least go on that virtual journey with you. That would be absolutely superb. Tell me a little bit about the key to this car. That is a whole story in itself, so I find absolutely fascinating.
Well, the key to the car is it's only a switch key. There's no key start at all on the car because it doesn't have a starter. There's very limited electrical system on the car, and the key just switches the coil box off and on. And so there are 2 positions on the coil box, well, 3 positions if you consider off. The mag position, which the car does have a magneto, it does generate a little bit of electricity, and it will run on its magneto. It's part of the flywheel. There are magnets all the way around the flywheel, and the magneto generates enough electricity to keep the car running. But also there's a battery position on the car. The cars are easier to start on battery when they're cold or they haven't been started for quite some time. The key was strange in that you could start the car with a fencing staple. They are about, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch wide. I think in inches. I don't think in metrics. 3/4 of an inch, it's 19 millimeters. and about 22 millimeters tall, or an inch and a half tall. And that's incorrect as far as the comparison goes. Like I said, I don't think in millimeters. I have to do the conversion really in my head, which I'm not good at. But you could start the car with the hand crank, or with the pulling it with a team of horses, or rolling it down a hill if you had a fencing staple.
So what we think of as a key being security, this had nothing to do with security then.
No, strictly convenience, because the car could be easily hot wired, and there's no security in a Model T, other than you had to be a bit of a magician to start the thing if you didn't own one.
Well, and that kind of leads me to my next question, because in watching the video, I mean, I see things I recognize like a steering wheel, and that's about where the similarities end for me. I mean, there are things to move and there are pedals, but they seem to function totally different than the cars that we've become accustomed to. Could you speak for a moment on what some of those differences are?
Certainly. Right beside the steering wheel, there are two levers, and those two levers are the gas feed. That's on the right-hand side where the turn signals would be. And on the left side is the spark advance. And those two levers move in about a 30 or 40 degree arc. And they are nothing more than hand controls that today we're used to having the accelerator pedal on the floor, unless you're driving an old tractor or an old car. And this car does not have an accelerator pedal. So in order to get the car to accelerate, you have to pull down on the speed lever or the fuel lever. And then along with that, you have to adjust the timing, because that's all done automatically now. Distributors did that from about 1930 all the way up through the 70s. And now we don't even have a distributor in a car.
I'm picturing the speed control. Do you have to hold it in place, or does it stay where you put it? I mean, this takes cruise control to a whole nother level thinking about that.
Well, it is a cruise control, but it doesn't come off when you step on the brake. So you have to slam the thing if you want to slow it down.
It stay wherever you put it.
It stays wherever you put it. And like I said, there are no gas pedals on the floor on any Model T that I know of. I don't think that they put those on there until the Model A, but I'm not familiar, disclaimer here, I'm not familiar with the very late models, the 1925, 6, 7 cars, because I haven't been around them that much. I've been around the earlier cars.
Mm-hmm. It is my understanding that they remain fundamentally unchanged, except for some minor details, for the whole run, which is one of the things that got Ford in trouble when it came time to retool for his Model A. That created some problems because he didn't change much. That wouldn't have been efficient. And if nothing else, Ford was a aficionado of efficiency. So there we go on that. Have you got anything else that you would like to add for us that maybe I forgot to ask?
The pedals on the floor are a little different on this car. Well, they're a lot different really on this car. There's no gear shift lever on this car. There are 3 pedals on the floor. The far left pedal is the gear pedal, and if you press it all the way to the floor, that's low gear, and halfway between the floor and released is neutral, and then when you release the pedal, it's in high gear. So it's a 2-speed transmission, and the forerunner of an automatic transmission. It has planetary gears, which are difficult to explain in a program like this, but interesting to see how they work if you want to look those up on YouTube or on the internet someplace. The middle pedal is the reverse pedal. And so the pedal that we would think of today as the brake pedal, if you had 3 pedals on the floor, which most cars don't anymore, but the middle pedal, you have to get the left pedal down halfway to put it in neutral, and then the reverse pedal down on the floor, push it down to get reverse. And then the brake pedal is on the right side where the accelerator would be. And so in order to brake, you have to push the gear pedal down halfway to get neutral, and then you can apply the brake. So when you're using both feet and steering and both hands, and you really are becoming one with the machine, I like to say.
Yeah, I'm an organist by profession, so for me, using both hands and both feet doesn't seem to be a particularly daunting challenge. But without that background, I think I would be rather intimidated. First time sitting in a Model T. You had mentioned earlier when we were visiting about the doors. Would you please tell us that story? That was wonderful.
The door on the Model T, there is no driver's door. There's a cutout area, not a cutout. There's a stamping where it looks like there's a driver's door, but it's solid sheet metal all the way down the side of the car where the driver's door would normally be, and the emergency brake lever is right where the driver's door would be. It was a strange way, but the driver had to slide across the seat in order to drive the car.
That's absolutely fascinating. Those little things are, I think, to me, in some ways, the most fascinating. We take so much of our technology for granted, and we think it's because this is the way that it is now. It is the way that it has always been. And to find out that something even as simple as a driver's side door is one of those things that has changed. It should make us where we're willing to consider that other things may have changed along the way in history too.
Well, that reminds me of a couple other changes. Many people are only used to having electric windows in their cars, and the Model T didn't have any windows at all. It had a windshield, but it didn't have any side windows on the earlier cars. My car never did have side windows. It had side curtains that you had to snap in place if it started raining. And that is something that's really different. It didn't even have a crank up window. There was no glass in the door at all. No track. And that made
those side curtains makes it sound more like a stagecoach.
Very similar. There are many of the things on this car are left over from the horseless carriage or the carriage era.
And then in another conversation, we had talked about how even some of our vocabulary is a residual of those, including floorboards.
That's right. The pedals rest or come through the wooden floorboards. And so we still call the floor on the car a lot of times floorboards, but we haven't had boards on the floor in any car that I know of since the early 60s. And there were very few cars that had those. I had a 1958 MG that had wooden floorboards in it, but that was one of the last cars I know of that had any kind of wood on the flooring.
Absolutely amazing. I thank you for being with us, and thank you for sharing your expertise. While there were a few things about that Model T that looked familiar, there's a great many other things that looked a lot different than today's cars. We can learn from the past, but we certainly do not live there. Go be awesome today and make your own history. Stick around for another story on how the car changed the culture of America.